They were an ordinary couple on an ordinary summer weekend. He was a teacher. She worked with students too. They packed their bags, loaded up their Volkswagen station wagon, and set out for a quiet night under the stars. No one could have known it would be their last trip. This story begins in August of 1985 in the vast forests of Pierce County, Washington, a place of rugged beauty, towering evergreens, and secluded lakes that draw campers from across the region. For Stephen Harkins and Ruth Cooper, it was supposed to be a simple escape from routine. A wedding reception, a one-night camping trip, and then back home. But when Monday morning came, and neither of them showed up for work, alarm bells began to ring. You step into the forest near Tule Lake and feel the hush. Stephen was 27 years old, a soft-spoken man with a love of the outdoors. Ruth was 42, a teacher's aide known for her warmth and dedication. They had been dating, and despite their busy schedules, they carved out time for each other. On the evening of August 10th, after attending a wedding, they decided to drive out to Tule Lake near Mineral, Washington. They brought along Stephen's dog. It was meant to be nothing more than a peaceful overnight stay. But when coworkers noticed their absence on Monday, it was out of character. Ruth never missed work without calling. Stephen was equally reliable. Families began to worry. Calls went unanswered, and so a missing persons report was filed. At first, there was hope that the couple had simply extended their trip. Maybe car trouble had delayed them. Maybe they had camped longer than expected. But days passed, and then a chilling discovery shattered all optimism. On Wednesday, a hiker wandering the trails near Tule Lake spotted something unusual. Stephen's Volkswagen was parked at a secluded spot, but the atmosphere around it felt wrong. When authorities returned on Friday to investigate, they unzipped a sleeping bag and found Stephen's body inside. He had been shot in the head at close range. Next to him lay his beloved dog, also dead. The forest that once promised serenity had become a crime scene. But where was Ruth? Search teams combed the area. They found one of her shoes not far from the campsite, but there was no sign of her body, no evidence of her struggle. The fear grew darker by the hour. For nearly 2 months, Ruth's fate remained a mystery. Then in late October, hunters near Hearts Lake stumbled upon human remains. A skull lying in the brush. Dental records confirmed it was Ruth. 2 days later, searchers recovered her body nearby. She had been shot in the abdomen. Around her neck was a haunting detail, a tube, sock tied tight. The discovery shook investigators. Stephen killed in his sleep. Ruth abducted, assaulted, and murdered. The tube sock stood out as an unusual, disturbing signature. Who would do this? And why? News of the murders spread quickly through Washington. For a region known for outdoor recreation, the idea that a killer was lurking in the woods terrified residents. Families who once camped freely now thought twice. Couples reconsidered trips. The forest, once a refuge, now carried the weight of fear. Detectives searched for leads. They canvassed the area. They checked known offenders. But the case refused to give up its secrets. No witnesses had seen anything. No fingerprints or physical evidence pointed to a suspect. The deaths of Stephen and Ruth were labeled homicides. Beyond that, little else was clear. Months passed. The forest grew cold with winter. And then, another couple entered the story. On December 12, 1985, barely 4 months after Stephen and Ruth vanished, 36-year-old Mike Reamer and his 21-year-old girlfriend Diana Robertson set out for a day in the woods. They brought their 2-year-old daughter, Crystal, along with them. It was supposed to be a festive outing. They would cut down a Christmas tree. They would tend to Mike's trap lines. Then they would return home, holiday cheer intact. But what happened next stunned the state. Later that same evening, Crystal was found wandering alone in a Kmart parking lot in Spanaway, Washington, nearly 30 miles from the wilderness. A store clerk noticed her walking aimlessly and called the police. The little girl was frightened, confused, and unable to explain how she had been left there. The only words she spoke about her parents chilled investigators. "Mommy is in the trees." Authorities launched a massive search. The story captured headlines across Washington. A toddler abandoned at a department store. 2 adults missing in the wilderness. The following day, searchers located Mike's red 1982 pickup truck abandoned on a remote logging road near Mineral. Inside the cab was a haunting clue, an envelope addressed to Diana. On it, written in large letters, were the words, "I love you, Diana." There are also bloodstains inside the vehicle. Then, on February 18th, 1986, 2 months later, a motorist discovered Diana's body near the truck. She had been stabbed 17 times. Around her neck, the same haunting detail, a tube sock tied tightly. Mike, however, was nowhere to be found. This case echoed the deaths of Stephen and Ruth with eerie similarity. Both couples vanished into the same forests of Pierce and Lewis counties. Both women were found with tube socks tied around their necks. Both men were missing or dead. For investigators, the parallels were impossible to ignore. They began to suspect they were dealing with something far more chilling than isolated crimes. Perhaps Washington had a serial killer hunting couples in the wilderness. The community grew restless. Was there a predator stalking the forests? Were campers being targeted? Detectives considered another possibility. What if Mike himself had killed Diana? After all, he had a history of domestic violence charges. He carried a .22 caliber pistol, the same weapon believed to have killed Stephen. His daughter being left at Kmart could suggest he had fled, abandoning her for safety. But the theory didn't sit right with everyone. If Mike had murdered Diana, why stab her 17 times and tie a tube sock around her neck in the same fashion as Ruth? Why leave such a distinct pattern that linked the cases together? Without Mike's body, no one knew for sure. For years, speculation swirled. Was Mike the killer? Or was he another victim of a faceless predator haunting the woods? The truth would remain buried until decades later, when the forest yielded one more chilling secret. Years slipped by. The cases of Stephen Harkins, Ruth Cooper, Mike Reamer, and Diana Robertson grew colder with every season. Families were left with grief and no answers. Reporters revisited the story from time to time, always noting the strange common thread: the tube socks, the wilderness, the sense of a predator moving unseen. Detectives struggled with the same questions. Were they hunting a serial killer? Or was Mike Reamer responsible for Diana's murder, leaving his daughter at Kmart before vanishing into the woods? Those who believed Mike was guilty pointed to his troubled past. He had been accused of assaulting Diana before. He was known to carry firearms. And the letter in his truck, "I love you, Diana," seemed both intimate and suspicious. Perhaps, they argued, it was a final message written after a crime of passion. But those who saw Mike as another victim pointed out the inconsistencies. Why leave his 2-year-old daughter alive, knowing she could immediately tell police where her parents had been? Why mimic the earlier murder of Ruth Cooper by tying a tube sock around Diana's neck? Why vanish so completely, with no trace for decades? The forest itself seemed to mock investigators, swallowing evidence and concealing the truth. In March 2011, 26 years after Mike and Diana vanished, the woods finally gave up another secret. 2 hikers exploring near Mineral stumbled upon a human skull fragment. The location was chillingly close to where Diana's body had been found back in 1986. Forensic testing confirmed what many had long suspected. The remains belonged to Mike Reamer. The discovery was devastating to some, vindicating to others. If Mike was dead, he might not have been the killer. But if he wasn't, then who was? Theories flared once again. Some detectives now leaned strongly toward the idea of a serial offender. Someone who had stalked couples in the Washington wilderness, attacking when they were most vulnerable. Stephen and Ruth. Mike and Diana. For lives lost. A toddler left behind. A chilling signature left behind in the form of a tube sock. But the identity of the killer remained unknown. To understand the fear these murders created, you need to imagine life in Washington in the mid-1980s. The forests of Pierce and Lewis counties were a place of escape for families, hunters, and campers. They were vast, covering hundreds of square miles. You could walk for hours and see no one. For decades, locals thought of the woods as safe, quiet retreats where danger felt far away. But after these killings, everything changed. Newspapers ran headlines warning campers. Parents told their children to stay away from remote trails. The wilderness, once a source of pride and beauty, now carried the heavy stain of unsolved violence. Even law enforcement admitted they were unnerved. They had few clues, no fingerprints, no confirmed weapon. The best they had were patterns. Couples targeted, remote locations, sudden violence, and the strange use of tube socks as bindings or ligatures. It was enough to terrify the public, but not enough to close the case. Consider the possibilities investigators weighed. Theory 1. Mike Reamer was the killer. He murdered Diana in a fit of rage, abandoned his daughter, and then took his own life in the woods. The tube sock was simply a coincidence, or perhaps an intentional copy of the earlier crime. Theory 2. A serial killer was on the prowl. Someone lurking in Washington's forests, targeting couples, and staging scenes with tube socks as a calling card. In this version, Mike and Diana were both victims, and Crystal's survival was a deliberate act by the killer. Theory 3. The cases were unrelated, bound together by coincidence and human imagination. But detectives and locals alike struggle with that explanation. The similarities felt too distinct, too deliberate. And yet, no arrests ever came. For the families left behind, the years were cruel. Ruth's relatives struggled with the horror of her abduction. Stephen's co-workers mourned a man who had dedicated himself to students. Diana's daughter Crystal grew up haunted by a past she barely remembered, forever marked as the toddler who whispered, "Mommy is in the trees." And Mike's family wrestled with his reputation, torn between those who saw him as a killer and those who believed he was another victim of the so-called tube sock killer. The name stuck. Reporters across the state began referring to the crimes as the tube sock killings. It was a shorthand that captured the macabre, inexplicable detail tying the cases together. The image of a simple sock transformed into a weapon of control, cruelty, and terror. The case also joined a wider cultural moment. In the 1980s, America was gripped by fears of serial killers. From the Green River Killer operating in Washington state to high-profile cases across the country, the public's imagination was filled with the idea of predators hiding in plain sight. The tube sock killings became another haunting entry in that terrifying era. Criminal profilers who later studied the case suggested that the killer, if not Mike, displayed traits of a highly opportunistic predator. Targeting couples in isolated settings showed both planning and boldness. The use of the tube sock could indicate ritual, a personal fetish, or simply a convenient item taken from the victims themselves. The extreme violence inflicted on Diana, 17 stab wounds, suggested rage and overkill, possibly a sign of a personal connection or a killer escalating his methods. And yet, the randomness of the victims, ordinary people, simply camping or gathering a tree, hinted at a stranger's hand. Someone with no connection to the victims, who struck quickly, vanished, and left nothing but questions behind. When Mike's skull was found, hopes briefly surged that DNA evidence could solve the case. But the remains were too old, too degraded. No usable forensic evidence was recovered. Technology had advanced since the 1980s, but it wasn't enough. Detectives revisited the files, hoping that new eyes might see what old ones had missed. But the trail was still cold. Witnesses had aged, memories had faded, and key evidence was long gone. The tube sock killings slipped further into the category of unsolved American mysteries. Today, nearly 40 years later, the forests of Pierce and Lewis counties are still there, towering, green, and silent. Hikers still walk the trails. Families still camp at the lakes. But for those who remember the 1980s, the woods carry a darker reputation. They are haunted not by ghosts, but by the memory of crimes that have never been solved. For every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, there's a lingering question. Who killed Stephen, Ruth, and Diana? Was Mike truly guilty, or was he a victim whose name was unfairly stained? Did a predator walk those trails, targeting couples, only to vanish without a trace? The answer may never be known, but the story endures not only in case files, but in the hearts of those who lost loved ones. For Ruth's family, for Stevens, for Diana's, and for Crystal, the little girl who survived but grew up with scars no child should ever carry. If you have information, authorities in Pierce and Lewis counties still want to hear from you. Cold cases do not die. They wait for a witness, a breakthrough, a moment of clarity. Until then, the tube sock killings remain one of Washington State's most haunting unsolved mysteries. If this story gripped you, remember there are countless other mysteries waiting to be told. Your support helps bring these forgotten cases back into focus, keeping the memories of victims alive and raising awareness that could one day bring answers. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into another chilling true crime mystery. Share this video with others who follow true crime stories and leave a comment with your thoughts or theories about the tube sock killings.